So for the last 8 years, you've been in the world of policing with Ryde YXE, but then a couple years ago, you decided to take a step back from policing and pursue some other things. Can you tell me about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think for a long time, I've been of the mindset that we can never stop asking ourselves what we want to be when we grow up. So getting into policing, I was hired as a police officer in 2005. But prior to that, I think as a student and as somebody going to university, we constantly ask people, well, what are you taking? What are you going to be when you grow up? Oh, you're in engineering, you're an engineer.
Right.
Oh, you're in nursing, you're a nurse. And that's it. We stop asking them. And what's even worse is we stop asking ourselves, right? We're defined by this like role, and then it's expected that you follow through with that. That's
you
it.
Stay in that box.
Right. Nobody asks you. But as humans, we know that we grow and evolve. And as someone that is like an education and growth seeker, I was never going to stay within that box. So it's one of the biggest things that I try to share is that we can't prevent ourselves from achieving whatever greatness we're seeking because we're defined by our early on decisions or education. So kind of moving through policing, I did that once with Ryde, kind of 10 years into a career that I've still maintained. And then it came to a point again that I was like, okay, where am I at? Am I still effective in my policing career? Am I giving it what I need? Should I transition into full-time business? What does that look like for me? And I honestly didn't know. I think I was in a position in policing that I didn't feel allowed me to kind of spread my wings and share my gifts and those types of things. And then we get stuck a little bit. So I had planned a sabbatical. You pay into it. The city here in Saskatoon has a program like that for civic employees where you can pay into a sabbatical for X amount of time and then you take time off and receive some form of a paycheck that you've had deducted in previous years. So that was my plan, just to kind of take some space, do some traveling, like reevaluate where things were at for me.
Can I just say, Shaina, so far in your story, what I find so powerful is that you recognize the space, you recognize the question mark. Because I think so many people start to feel stagnant or complacent in whatever they're doing, but they power through.
Right.
They're like, oh, whatever. Like, I might not love this job right now, but this is the career that I chose. I'm kind of interested in this thing, but there really isn't Indigenous police women, but I'm going to power through and pick that every day. So you really like have this magic skill of recognizing a gap or a question mark, and not everybody has that. So I just wanted to say that.
Thank you. Yeah, it's challenged me in many ways too. I've been through divorce. I've done those aspects of growth and change too, and that comes with challenges for sure, but it also comes with landing happier, more fulfilled, all of those things. So it's worth it in the long run. And I think just coming to this point of this break, I kind of just sat with it and I didn't have really big plans. And then as life does, it threw me a bit of a curveball, and my mom was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer, and it was terminal. It had a terminal diagnosis, and I was kind of like, okay, wow.
And this was so you've taken this time away.
Yeah, I hadn't even started it yet.
Oh, wow.
So I was just working towards that time. I actually still had another year that I was going to work prior to that leave.
Right.
To save up a little bit more, because I'd only saved for 2 years, and I was planning to do a little more time for saving. And it just became critical that I needed to make that happen now. Yeah. One of the biggest questions I get asked often is, well, how does balance look in your life? How do you balance all of these things? As an entrepreneur, a mom, that's always a big conversation, right? How do you find it? Doesn't exist.
No.
I feel like, honey, you're not going to find it.
Yeah.
And it's just more so something that I've lived by of like, where am I needed right now? Where am I needed?
Yeah.
I need to make a choice. I need to commit to that. And I cannot feel guilt or shame for not choosing any of the other things. Yeah. And it's just, that's the way that it is. I'm choosing it, and I will respect my own decision and not look back.
That is like the healthiest, best definition of balance as a working parent I've ever heard.
Amazing.
Yeah.
I still live by it. You know, that's just the way that it works. And yeah, I just made a commitment to my mom and to my family. So I asked for my leave early, a year early from the police service. And what a blessing. You know, it's much the same as business or as other family choices or growth. I was needed in that moment with my mom. And oh, wow, like what it was a privilege in my life.
Yeah.
Truly.
To be with her.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Hold her hand.
Yep.
Yeah.
So she went through, and I'll get a bit emotional about it, but 25 rounds of chemo, and it was through a pandemic. So people weren't even allowed to be there. They're still not support people.
Yeah.
Even with a terminal diagnosis, they're showing up knowing that they're going to die and without somebody next to them. So it was something that I needed, you know, and she needed. And I took every possible opportunity. So I wasn't at work. I took that step back. I went to every appointment. I drove her to every doctor's office. I rode in the ambulance with her on every occasion. I fought this Sask Health Authority. I shouldn't say that too loud, but that's the reality is like when somebody you love needs something, wow, advocacy becomes your number one.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, whether it's your child, your spouse, your parent, and that is your priority.
Yeah.
And that was my choice. And I regret nothing that occurred in place of that.
Yeah.
You know,
That's proud. Like it sounds like this very time that you're proud of.
Totally.
Yeah.
You know, and it's just, it's another example of, not looking back. I wouldn't choose it differently. And there is such a blessing in not having regret. Right?
Yeah.
Yes. Because you can't change. I couldn't change her diagnosis. I couldn't change her death.
Right.
I had no impact in that. What I could change is not having regret over the way that I carried and held myself.
Yeah. How fully you loved her.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Love her.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you shared so much of that journey through your Instagram and social media. And like, there's so many moments that I was thinking about you and praying about your family. And like, you know, really, I've been in your peripheral, but we don't have that direct of a relationship, right? So I can just imagine like the circles of people that were holding their hands over you, praying over you and your family during that time. And I think just the way that you shared it it just felt so real, but so loving.
Yeah.
Like it felt like, you know, like this thing is happening and it's terrible, but it was just, you created so much love around it. It was really beautiful to watch.
Oh, thank you. And you know, it was an important aspect to share because I think in those journeys, we feel very alone, you know, and we aren't as forthcoming with challenges, fear, sadness. It's hard to share and it's very, very vulnerable to share when you're not your best, when you can't do those things.
So many people don't really feel it. Like they do a good job of just like kind of surviving the moment, but you felt it and were in the moment and you shared it. Like that's a beautiful
Jumped
gift.
in. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And you know, I kind of had to talk my mom through some of those things because she's also like, no, don't show pictures of me. I don't have my hair and I'm wearing this, or I don't have makeup or whatever it looks like. And I was like, that's not what it's about, Mom. It's about everybody thinking of you, of us, directing energy, prayers, exactly like what you're sharing. So part of that was, let's just reach to our circles. Maybe it will give us more time.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. And it also made everybody hug their loved ones a little tighter, right? Like my mom lives in BC and I only get to see her so much of the time, but I like that experience, Shaina, it impacted the time that I spent with my mom the last 2 years.
What a gift that so many people have shared that with me that, oh, you know what? I look at my challenging relationship with my mom differently. I want to make an effort differently. I want to reevaluate what my own relationship looks like because I have a gift of my mom present or here, you know, and maybe I'm not utilizing it as much as I could and whatever that looks like. And wow, like what a gift to help other people just by sharing and being vulnerable. So that's amazing.
Thank you for that. Yeah. So you take this time off and you're with mom and go through that whole process. And you're in school at the same time.
So I had made a decision later. I kind of went through the first 6 months or so of just spending total time with my mom. I was still involved in Ryde, but I took time off of teaching. I had a lot of people doing a lot of my jobs and just tried to be more present at home. And it was getting later in the year, over summer, into fall, and my mom was still with us, but she wasn't doing well. And I think for me, knowing, okay, how much longer do we have? What will her health look like? And then getting later in the year, which was my only year off, I had 1 year sabbatical. Would I then be in a capacity to go back to policing, to patrol? That's where I would go back to trauma, to be exposed to community trauma amidst my own trauma.
Right.
Could I do that? Would I be effective? Is that going to set me back? What does that look like? So it meant making some challenging decisions and, furthering my education has always been in the back of my mind, not because of what it will get me in terms of, financial reward or promotion or anything like that. It doesn't necessarily. Maybe in the future it will, but my goal was more so just to be an ongoing learning seeker of knowledge, right? And it was something that I was like, okay, I'm going to apply for this. My mom taught at the University of Saskatchewan for 20 years in indigenous studies. So she went back and got her master's as an adult as well. And, that goes back to some of those little conversations of like, okay, things that people do or say can impact us. And I kind of was like, okay, well, I can go back as an adult with kids. I saw my mom do it.
Right.
So that felt very familiar. And it was something that I kind of just took the leap, talked to my husband. What does this look like? This time I won't have any income, right? I was on a sabbatical with a partial income, a 50% income. Mm-hmm. Now I will have no income. So that challenging dynamic.
Right.
But super supportive, of course, always. And, I applied to Arizona State University to take my master's in organizational leadership, really only last fall. And I got a letter on September 30th, mm-hmm. Orange Shirt Day, Truth and Reconciliation, saying you got into this program.
Wow.
And I started October 12th.
So,
2 weeks later.
Which is interesting because our conversation October 12th this year was a significant date for you as well. Mm-hmm. So that's interesting. But sorry, and because we haven't gotten to the indigenous part of what you were studying, why was it important that you received that letter on Truth and Reconciliation Day?
Like, wow, what a full circle moment. Just in terms of knowledge seeking and an opportunity for, especially as an Indigenous female, to be in leadership capacities, extended learning opportunities, a representative of our nations. What does that look like? Wow.
Yeah.
Opportunity.
Yeah.
It looks like the way that things have progressed in a good way.
Yeah.
And
shows the progress, right? Symbolic of the progress.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And what were you, so you were studying
organizational leadership.
Okay.
Yeah. So I had started that. And within the first week of starting school, I've shared photos I have of sitting with my mom in the background and kind of starting school. And she ended up being hospitalized that first week of me starting. I rode in an ambulance with her. She was hospitalized for multiple days through significant blood loss and complications, with cancer. And she also ended up with a colostomy bag and just significant challenges. Mm. And wow, did I reevaluate? Could I do this? Full time as a student, be in this space and capacity, sitting in a hospital room doing this, because that is still my priority. Right. My mom was still my priority, but I needed to kind of evaluate how I could give myself some grace and space as I moved forward after. So for the first little bit, it was really challenging. And she passed away 36 days after I started my master's. So that was it.
Yeah.
And the amazing part about it is I shared with her, this is my intention. This is what I want my applied project to look like. This is what I hope to do. And she just brainstormed with me. She offered everything she could that I utilized the whole time. So I definitely like had guidance, even though I didn't.
Yeah. But she co-created with you this next stage of life, really. Yeah.
Very much.
Yeah. And what is your applied project on? I think that's important to this
Yeah,
conversation.
you know what? Okay. So initially in this space, I knew that, okay, I'm going to do this master's for a full year. And I had every intention of working on my business, applying it to entrepreneurship, to being, you know, the leader that I was within my own realm that I had full control over. Because that's where I felt like maybe I could make the biggest impacts.
Right.
Because I had the ability to implement anything that I wanted.
Right.
And yet I started school and I was taking these courses, you know, on leadership theory and on conflict resolution and on leading diverse teams. And I was constantly going back to the police service. Everything that I was writing about in terms of culture and change and progression called me back to the police service over and over and over. So I knew right from the beginning that it had to be on the police service. I had to focus on change and what I could do to implement into the police service. And I designed my entire applied project from the beginning, and I stayed through with it the entire year of full-time school. So my applied project is on the indigenous experience in Saskatchewan, assessing municipal police officers' knowledge on indigenous history and the educational gaps that exist and how we can address them. So I focused on taking a sample size of the Saskatoon Police Service as a representation of municipal officers across the province. And essentially I conducted a survey. I conducted a literature review of anything that it can apply to it across Canada in terms of community policing, getting to know Indigenous history, what reconciliation looks like, policing in Indigenous communities, all of the information and what would best be implemented, where, when, and how to further reconciliation within policing, to improve the police-Indigenous relationship, not just within Saskatchewan, but eventually across Canada.
Okay. And what, just at a very high level, what are the tenets? Is it around education? Is it around engagement? Is it around like what is missing?
You know what? It comes down to not just community policing, but the beginning of community policing is establishing who our community are. We need to know them. We need to see them. We need to understand them. You know, if we think we're going to affect change or, you know, or elevate a human person, we need to know them.
Right.
You know, and you think about the capacity that you have when you know someone or you see their story or you are told of who they are and the change in you. Oh, wow, they've experienced this? Oh my gosh. And the way that you can connect with another human based on understanding changes your reaction, intention, and actions, right? And that's what I'm going for. It's like that connection piece.
Yeah.
So
helping the community feel seen as a way of building a bridge.
Right. And, you know, we know that our Indigenous population is approximately 17% in Saskatchewan. The overrepresentation of Indigenous people incarcerated, 2022, the Canadian census said that 88% of those incarcerated are identified as Indigenous.
In Canada.
In Saskatchewan.
In Saskatchewan. 88% versus 17% of the population.
Significant.
Yeah.
So where is the gap here? And, you know, we talk about what's current and what's historical. And I think there's sometimes a divide, and this happened a long time ago. These things, residential schools, the 60s scoop, whatever this looks like, it was a long time ago. There's a belief by many individuals that it's time to get over these things. These people can, you know, help themselves.
Right.
I've heard it.
Oh yeah, I've heard it. We've all heard it. Yeah.
We've all heard it.
Yeah.
So there's a disconnect there.
Yeah.
There's a disconnect between the generational trauma that still exists. It's very current.
Yes.
You know, I'm a 41-year-old person, And I'm the first generation to be raised by my parents on my maternal side. That is very current.
Yeah.
You know, my mom grew up in the 60s scoop. My great grandmother attended residential schools. There's significant trauma and alienation from culture, community, and family.
Yeah. No. And like when you think of that, like you say, you know, it's so easy to say, but like when you think about that, and I just think about, for me, like, because that's what you do. You compare it to your experience and you figure out like, okay, like, so to not have that history, for your mom to have had that trauma and then to turn around and raise you and your siblings and like had to have to manage that as really a mother who never really saw that experience. She never saw a mother. She never saw that role. She never saw how to nurture and care for children. And she did that for the first time with you and your brother, right? It's the two
and
of
my
you?
sister.
So so the three of you. And and like to not have had that, I'm sure her connection with her mother, I'm making some assumptions here, that had to have been different because of the way that each of them were raised. Like that's
Totally.
when you just think about practically what that looks like in your day-to-day life as you're raising your children. Like that's everything, Shaina.
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally. And you know what? I gifted her this frame. I had my daughters gift it to her, and it's a frame, and it's just has a kind of a quote on it that says, "Every woman who heals herself heals her children's children." Understanding that, you know, as trauma exists generationally, so does healing.
Yeah.
Right? So recognizing that her choice and her actions and her dedication to her own healing and breaking cycles now is shown in 3 little girls, gifting her this that have these beautiful lives.
Right. Yeah.
So what power?
What power? Yeah. Okay. Wow. So, you know, entrepreneurship, a policewoman, an indigenous policewoman who has now taken on this education and has the skill set and has done all of this research in this space. As an indigenous woman, Shaina, how does the business community, whether it's small, large corporations, whatever it might be, how does the business community respond to the call to action in order to progress truth and reconciliation? Like, how does business make a difference and support this process?
Yes. Well, first of all, as business leaders, as people in the community, regardless of your role, let's break that apart for a second into truth and into reconciliation, because the first part of it is truth. And that lends to the reasoning behind my applied project, discovering the truth, telling the truth, sharing that knowledge, providing a baseline of understanding so that then there can be reconciliation. And so I think where people are falling short is on the truth. They're willing to show up. They're willing to put their own shirt on. They're willing to support Indigenous colleagues, hire Indigenous people. They're willing to do those things. Where things have lacked is on discovering truth. It's on offering programs, education, whatever that looks like, to educate managers, owners, operators on the history of the Indigenous experience in Saskatchewan, in Canada, and how that pertains to the actions behind reconciliation.
And there's so many great speakers out there right now. There's so many people that are willing to come into your business and they're able to engage a large group of people and have a conversation that can be received very well.
Yeah.
Because I every single one, like we've been fortunate enough that we've done this every year now for the last 4 years at Lafarge, Saskatchewan specifically.
Yeah.
And every single speaker that we've had, and I think we've had 3 unique ones. We had one gentleman come twice. But every single person at some point in the beginning of their introduction or their opening remarks talks about like, I am not here to shame anybody. This is something like shame cannot be a part of this conversation.
Absolutely.
This is a discussion to understand what happened, to essentially understand where we are today and how we got to this point, right?
Yes.
Like that really is the objective of
Absolutely.
the truth. Yeah. So there's great resources, I think.
You know what? You hit the nail on the head there. Learning doesn't come from a place of shame, ever.
Yes.
So any presenter or speaker or somebody coming into any workplace or community or circles or whatever it might be that is coming from a shame and blame approach is not doing this process of reconciliation and justice. And I say that over and over. And again, that goes back to my applied project in terms of having education and information delivered to police officers from a policing lens. Understand the historical roles that the RCMP had in residential schools, in apprehending children, in enforcing, treaty agreements and all of these different things. Just understand the history of those roles and the disconnect between the police indigenous relationship. Let's just talk about that. Not shaming you as an officer today. No. Just understand the history so that moving forward, we can rebuild a relationship from a place of knowledge and understanding.
Yeah. And also you as a police person has that perspective of like, okay, this is why I'm not always welcome. Why when I show up in the uniform and the lights on or not, like that's why I'm not always well received because of this long-standing history. Yes. Maybe not necessarily nothing that's happening in the moment, but this history of it.
And that's challenging. You know what? I very much identify with both groups. With the policing side and with the indigenous side. And lots of people ask me, well, who do you identify more with? Oh. Well, I'm an indigenous person, but by heart and blood, I wear a uniform to be a police officer. So understanding that's not who I am, we have to kind of disconnect our identity from that uniform. But approaching situations, I feel it. I feel the hate. I feel the traumas that have affected generations. And you know what? It's for good reason. It's when you're having kids apprehended, when the roles of the police officers are contributing to that trauma, not because it's their decisions or actions, but they unfortunately are the ones enforcing some of those even needed circumstances, in child welfare or whatever it might be. So you're right. When you show up in a police uniform, it's the uniform talking. It's not Shaina, the person, the indigenous female, the mother. It's a uniform showing up to people. And it's hard to bridge that gap. And it's hard as an officer to receive that kind of detest and dislike from communities and from people. So I empathize with that position. But as leaders in our community, it's up to us to take those first steps.
Right. It puts you in a really great position though, Shaina. Like you almost have to be the one to be that bridge because you have both perspectives. You're the police person showing up in a uniform and you're the indigenous mother who can relate to like, how dare anybody think about taking my child away from me, right? Like absolutely. Like you need to be that bridge, really.
Absolutely. And it's a big role and it's a big responsibility that I definitely don't take lightly.
Yeah. So really focusing on the truth piece, bringing in the right speakers that are able to really train everybody at every level of your organization is kind of where you'd recommend to start.
Absolutely. It's a perfect place to start. And, relating it back to the calls to action, specifically for business, we talk about call to action 92. For policing, we talk about call to action 57. They're essentially the same. In different roles. 157 is directed at public servants. 92 is directed at the business community. It's saying the same things. Educate our people. Provide opportunity. So, for business, look at indigenous procurement options or opportunities. Look not just to hire indigenous people, but how now will you retain them and further promote them? What does that look like? Because we're not just trying to tick a box and say we have X amount of indigenous employees and staff. We are looking to how to bring those indigenous experience and voices to the table. Right. Give them a platform. Yeah. Include their ways of doing and being in our workplace environments. And I think that's another aspect where people often miss the mark. You might have an amazing recruiting strategy, but you're wasting your money and your time and your efforts if you don't have an equally aggressive retention and promotion strategy.
Absolutely.
And that's something that for me, I get asked all the time. Okay, how do you have so many indigenous women that work at Ryde, which is like essentially a pretty traditionally colonial space, fitness. Yep. You think about the Ken and the Barbies that represent the fitness industry, right? And how do you bring so many indigenous women to work in that space? And the answer is so simple. I don't have a recruiting strategy. I am the recruiting strategy.
Right.
So by simply having Indigenous leadership, Indigenous female leadership, it lets Indigenous women know not only are they welcome here, they can succeed here.
Right.
Because that's what the leader is doing and saying and being, So we're missing the mark when we don't have that Indigenous representation through all levels.
Right. Right. And that is a huge gap today, I think.
Very much.
In the business space as well. Because yes, I think, and like, quite frankly, so truth and reconciliation is coming up and it's becoming better understood and better applied. But the business, big industrial enterprises, mining companies have done a really good job of saying, hey, listen, this is a part of our community and we want them to be engaged. So your procurement, your package that you're pricing to us has to include Indigenous participation and Indigenous engagement, et cetera, right? But to your point, I think too often it's treated like a check mark versus a way of like meaningful, changing an organization in a meaningful way to be a partner.
Absolutely.
And I see it changing already. Yeah. But it's slow, right?
It is slow. So
if kind of the baseline or the basic or the way to start is to bring in that truth piece in the speakers, what's that next level, Shaina? Like, an organization that's been doing that for a period of time, and asking selfishly here, because I think that's kind of where Lafarge, Saskatchewan is we've done a lot of the basic things that we can do. But what's the next step? Like, how do we become a better partner?
I think you need to figure out how to take the Lafarge employees that are that representation, that are that checkbox,
right?
Like what we're talking about. How do we get them to be at the tables?
Right.
How do we have their voices and their experience affect our systems?
Right.
Because, we're never going to rise to the level of our goals as much as we will fall to the level of our systems. And until we have that Indigenous perspective included in our systematic changes,
right,
we'll never get anywhere.
Our decision making,
our
key strategic decision making needs to have an Indigenous voice at that table.
Absolutely. And that's where how we recognize, even our biases, the ways that we might not even recognize in ourselves, in our decision making, in our processes, because we're so conditioned to live in those colonial spaces and have this understanding that sometimes we can't even recognize it ourselves. And it takes someone else to say, well, hold on here, there's this. And you're like, okay, wow, I didn't think of that. Right. That's what it takes.
Right. Very interesting. And I feel like we jumped right into the issue, right? Which is a huge issue, and it's been great conversation. But I'm just curious, like, as an Indigenous woman whose mother grew up in the foster system and whose grandmother was a residential school survivor. Like, so just talk to me about like your identity today as a 41-year-old Indigenous woman. Like, what does that mean to you?
It has been such a process of reclaiming. It's not something that I was obviously born into this by blood. However, because of these experiences, because of these historical practices of residential schools, of the 60s scoop, and a lot of people have an understanding of what residential schools are or were, but maybe not necessarily the 60s scoop. And essentially what it was is the government's way of further eradicating Indigenous practices and people by apprehending Indigenous children into white foster homes or homes. So they actually had like an AIM program that essentially almost like what you would see at the SPCA, where this dog is available for adoption. They have brown eyes. This is their temperament. This is what they do. They're looking for adoption. That's quite literally the process. Those handouts existed. I have one of my uncles on them.
So they would pull children out of their homes and then go through this process. And pretty much any Indigenous child out of their home. It was literally a scoop, to your point.
It was a scoop. Yeah, it was a scoop. Yeah. So now these kids grew up. My mom grew up in 7 foster homes, many of which were significantly abusive in some way or fashion. And she had no culture. She had no connection. It was up to her to reestablish later in life or try to keep in contact with her siblings. There's 10 of them in total. And thankfully now they actually are in contact. And I don't think that would be, I don't want to say normal. Nothing's normal about this process, but that's probably fairly unlikely, right? That they do have that connection.
All 10.
All 10. Yeah. Wow. But she just didn't have any teachings. She didn't have culture established. She never fully knew who she was, I don't think. And sadly, to her death.
Yeah. And how, I'm just thinking about how would she do that? Like how at that point, when you haven't had that deep relationship and history, and it's not like she could reach out to her mom that had it, like, and even how to use Shaina. So when you say you're reclaiming all these parts of yourself, is how do you connect to these things that haven't been present for a couple generations?
Totally. So, like we didn't grow up smudging. We didn't grow up with ceremony. We didn't grow up with teachings, all of those things. We, in fact, somewhat identified with my dad's side of the family, which is Ukrainian. My dad is 100% probably one of the few remaining individuals. His bloodline immigrated here from Ukraine. My grandparents all spoke Ukrainian. We just aligned ourselves with Ukrainian culture growing up. And to be totally honest, because of the way that society was, in the early 90s in my childhood, I didn't identify with being an Indigenous person, and I would hear the things that people would say about Indians, right? So why would I expose myself to being included in those terrible circumstances and things? Yeah. So in no way did I even want to connect myself with that at the time. So I fully embraced that Ukrainian culture. But I think growing up and, as we talked about before, recognizing some of those gaps in myself, I sit with, and I know that it became up to me to reclaim. And that meant learning the same as a lot of others, understanding what ceremony brings to our life, creating spirituality, teaching that to my kids. And that's been an incredible process. It's been very rewarding and very challenging. For the first few years of it, I cried and cried and cried when I had opportunities to listen to the old people, to our elders and to our knowledge keepers. I would just sob because I didn't know how to receive that.
Right.
And it was so sad.
Just connected, right? Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that was through your mom's family. You talk about these, like where this community, how do you connect to that, Shaina? And I'm sorry, like it sounds like such a basic question, but I'm just like, how do you get there?
But you're so right. It seems like it should be fairly basic, and it's sad that it's not.
Yeah.
It's hard to seek circles. It's hard to, I'm a member of Yellow Quill First Nation, so we're Soto. And even immersing myself in Soto language speakers, there's not a lot around, so you have to look for credible elders and knowledge keepers and old people in those communities to receive teachings from.
Right.
And it's a really dedicated process. And you know what? I started it through policing. Oddly enough, aspects of my former police chief, Clive Wayhill, he had an elders advisory group, which still exists for the police chief. And there's elders that attend from all nations and kind of share insights and advice and a lot of those things. And they go to ceremonies together and they teach. And that was my initial learnings is through that, is through the connections of bringing all of those elders together and sitting in a space that I wouldn't have been able to otherwise access that learning.
Right. And yet it's a deep part of your ancestry. Yeah,
very much. And so since that process, I've been able to engage in different aspects of ceremony that's been so healing. And sadly, like my mom never really truly got to reclaim and engage in the same way.
Right. Right.
She was a knowledge seeker. Like I said, she taught Indigenous studies. She really focused on that knowledge piece, that truth piece in teaching youth.
Yeah.
But that spiritual piece, she was spiritual, but not in an Indigenous way.
So again, a little bit off topic, but I'm just like, as we're talking about your mother, Shaina, like where did, I just like thinking about the resolve it takes to be in 7 different foster homes as you're growing up, separated from your family of origin, to be in a place I'm assuming based on my experience in Saskatoon over the last 13 years, like there was probably a lot of racism that she had to deal with as she's coming up. How did she get from that place to a university teacher to having a successful marriage, parenting these 3 kids that like, how did she get to such a healthy, well-balanced place? Like it sounds like for sure there was gaps, but from where she started to where she got to, like that's incredible.
Oh yeah. She's a hero.
Yeah.
Legit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just
Yes.
who she is.
Yeah.
Just the
You know
resolve
what?
in her.
Yes. It's like a refusal to give up.
Yeah.
It was, the same grit that we identify in who succeeds as an entrepreneur. Perhaps that's where it's gifted to me from.
Yes.
It's that grit.
Yeah.
It was that determination. And, I think part of her identification process of like, this is what I didn't have in my life, this, family dynamic, this love and, capacity to connect to family is what I don't have. And it is my number one goal in life. And she lived into that.
Yeah.
Huge.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Which probably says a lot about your father as well.
Oh,
I just imagine he's a very special man as
well.
Very,
very.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. And so we're in it. We're in the middle of truth and reconciliation and all the transformation that needs to come from it. Where do you hope that it will take us in the next 20, 30 years? What does success look like throughout this process?
Well, we touched on the overrepresentation of Indigenous people in the justice system. That needs to be decreased through systemic changes.
Right.
And I can only speak to my individual roles as policing in that capacity and how we can look to support communities, fulfill knowledge and understanding in the truth piece and change our interactions. But the reality is this takes complete community and systemic change to affect that lowering of that overrepresentation piece. That means that we have significant supports in child welfare. We have Indigenous representation in the workforce. We have at your fingertips healing and opportunities to reconnect and reclaim. I was blessed to have that circle presented to me. That's not available openly to other people that might look to heal.
So thank you so much, Shaina, for doing this. Like, a big part of why I wanted to do this podcast is I just felt like there was something missing for me. There was that space. And that space was, I wasn't learning in the same way that I'd been learning for the last 10 plus years previously. And one of the biggest ways I learn is this, right? Like hearing someone's experience and stories and taking lessons out of that.
Yeah.
And originally when I reached out to you, the story that I really wanted to hear was the story about how you went from policing through entrepreneurship to launch Ryde YXE. And then like very quickly in our conversation, I was like, oh, there's a huge like truth and reconciliation and Shaina's experience as an Indigenous woman in policing. And like, it's just, there's so many lessons that have come out of this story. So just thank you so much for sharing it.
Oh, my absolute pleasure. I think that is a key piece of what a lot of us are missing is just understanding and taking the time and space to listen to each other's stories and to figure out how we play significant roles within one another's stories. That's such a key piece. We can elevate our connections with one another just in terms of how we are willing to listen and hold space for that. And, it's kind of a wild concept, but after my mom passed and we planned her funeral, we actually utilized her stories. She wrote a chapter in a book, and my sister and I shared her life story from our perspective, information, details, where she was born, how she grew up, that kind of stuff. And then my brother actually spoke her words, told her story in her words. And so many people shared with us that it was one of the most impactful celebrations of life because of the connection they felt to her story. Right. And what better way than to celebrate someone's life than to share their story? But why wait? Right? Let's listen to each other's stories now. Yeah. Share them, connect with them, be a part of them, and, you know, instead of when their chapter has ended. And that's going to be kind of my next phase. She actually wrote another book that is unpublished. So I'm so excited to share her story and figure out how I can interject that into, you know, my future too.
Yeah. Which goes back to my question about your mom. Like, I feel like just what an amazing woman. Like, yeah, that's a story that I would sign up to listen to for sure. Yeah.
Well, I'm excited someday.
Awesome. Thank you, Shaina.
My pleasure.